May 14, 1942, 2:30 a.m., Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building. Commander Joseph John Rochefort stood before a wall covered with intercept transcripts whose arrangement reflected connections that existed only in the minds of the men who had been staring at them for 72 consecutive hours. The room smelled of stale coffee that had been reheated beyond any reasonable definition of potability, cigarette smoke that had accumulated into visible layers beneath ceiling lights that never dimmed, and the particular odor of men who had not bathed or changed clothes in days, because bathing and changing clothes required leaving a space whose secrets could not be abandoned. Rochefort was 41 years old, a former enlisted sailor from Los Angeles who had taught himself Japanese during a 3-year posting in Tokyo, who had learned cryptanalysis through correspondence courses and stubborn application, who had risen to command Station Hypo through demonstrated competence rather than the academy pedigree that naval tradition typically required. He wore a maroon smoking jacket over his uniform, a robe over the smoking jacket, and carpet slippers instead of regulation shoes, an appearance that visiting officers found unmilitary and that Rochefort found practical for work that permitted neither sleep nor formality. The basement where he worked had been designed for storage, not intelligence analysis. Its ventilation was inadequate for the men it now housed. Its lighting was inadequate for the documents those men examined. Its existence was a secret that determined the Pacific War's outcome. His team had partially broken JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational code, through months of labor whose tedium outsiders could not comprehend and whose results outsiders could not evaluate. The intercepts they decoded arrived in fragments whose assembly required intuition that no procedure could replicate. Gaps filled through pattern recognition that experience developed and exhaustion degraded. The picture emerging from those fragments showed the Japanese Navy preparing something massive, concentrations of carriers and battleships and transports that indicated an offensive operation whose target appeared throughout the intercepts as a 2-letter designator, AF. Rochefort believed AF was Midway, the atoll 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, whose strategic position made it the obvious American outpost that Japanese planners would want to eliminate. The belief rested on analysis whose components included geographic references in decoded messages, directional bearings from radio intercept stations, and the accumulated understanding of Japanese naval thinking that years of study had provided. The analysis was not certain. Cryptanalysis never achieved certainty. The analysis was probable, and probability was what intelligence offered commanders whose decisions could not wait for the certainty that would arrive only after those decisions no longer mattered. Washington disagreed. OP-20G, the Navy's central code-breaking organization, had examined the same intercepts and reached different conclusions. Their analysts believed AF might designate the Aleutian Islands, or possibly targets in the South Pacific, or possibly Australia itself. The disagreement reflected not incompetence, but the inherent ambiguity of fragmentary intelligence interpreted by men whose institutional positions shaped their analytical assumptions. Washington saw Pacific strategy from a global perspective that distributed threats across multiple possible targets. Rochefort saw Pacific strategy from a basement in Hawaii, where the concentration of Japanese naval power pointed toward something that global perspectives might obscure. The disagreement was not academic. Admiral Chester Nimitz would position his carriers based on intelligence assessments whose accuracy would determine whether the Pacific Fleet achieved surprise or sailed into it. 3 carriers represented American offensive capability in the Pacific: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. the last still damaged from the Coral Sea engagement and undergoing repairs that would permit deployment but not full operational capacity. The Japanese were bringing at least 4 carriers, possibly more, supported by battleships whose firepower exceeded anything Nimitz could deploy. If Rochefort was correct about Midway, positioning carriers to intercept the Japanese approach would produce the ambush that inferior forces required. If Rochefort was wrong about Midway, positioning carriers northeast of Midway would leave them absent from wherever the actual Japanese target was, or worse, would place them in locations the Japanese had anticipated and prepared to destroy. The basement's air grew thicker as another night merged into another morning without resolution, without sleep, without the certainty that would have permitted either. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Thomas Layton carried Rochefort's analysis across Pearl Harbor to the headquarters, where Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for intelligence that would determine how he deployed the forces remaining after December 7th's catastrophe. The morning air smelled of tropical flowers and diesel fuel from the harbor, where salvage operations continued on battleships whose destruction had eliminated the fleet that pre-war planning had assumed would fight Japan. The walk from Station Hypo to Sinpak headquarters covered less than a mile. The distance between the conclusions Layton carried and the conclusions Washington insisted upon could not be measured in any unit of physical space. Layton was 38 years old, a Naval Academy graduate from Illinois, whose career had included a posting as Assistant Naval Attaché in Tokyo during the 1930s, years when he had learned the Japanese language, studied Japanese naval doctrine, and developed the understanding of Japanese strategic thinking that intelligence work required. He had known many of the officers now commanding the fleet that threatened Midway, had attended their social functions and observed their professional exercises, had accumulated human intelligence that signals intelligence could supplement but not replace. The men planning whatever Operation AF designated were not abstractions to Layton. They were professionals whose methods he had studied and whose patterns he could anticipate. The relationship between Layton and Nimitz represented something that Soviet command culture had systematically destroyed: institutional trust that permitted subordinates to present conclusions that contradicted headquarters without fear that contradiction would be prosecuted as disloyalty. Nimitz had established this relationship deliberately during his first days as Sinpak, summoning Layton to his office and asking a question whose answer revealed everything about the command culture he intended to build. He asked Layton to tell him what he thought, and he meant it. The question seemed simple. Its implications were profound. A commander who asked subordinates what they thought was a commander who acknowledged that subordinates might possess knowledge the commander lacked, that analysis from below might correct assumptions from above, that the hierarchy which military organization required did not eliminate the possibility that hierarchical superiors might be wrong. Nimitz had spent decades in a navy whose traditions included respect for expertise that rank alone could not provide. He understood that the intelligence officer standing before him possessed information about Japanese intentions that no amount of command authority could generate independently. Layton presented Rochefort's analysis with the directness that Nimitz's question had authorized. The intercepts pointed to Midway. The timing suggested late May or early June. The forces involved included at least 4 carriers, possibly the entire combined fleet, an armada whose concentration indicated objectives beyond what minor operations would justify. Washington's disagreement reflected analytical assumptions that Rochefort's team did not share, interpretations of ambiguous evidence that Station Hypo's proximity to the Pacific permitted seeing differently than distance allowed. Nimitz listened. The listening itself was significant, a commander absorbing intelligence rather than interrogating the intelligence officer who presented it. weighing evidence rather than demanding compliance with conclusions that command authority had predetermined. He asked questions whose purpose was clarification rather than challenge, probing the analysis to understand its foundations rather than to expose its weaknesses for rejection. The contrast with Soviet command culture required no explicit articulation for men who understood what American military tradition permitted and what other traditions prohibited. An intelligence officer in Layton's position presenting analysis that contradicted Moscow headquarters would have faced consequences that career damage could not adequately describe. Contradiction was insubordination. Insubordination was disloyalty. Disloyalty was treason, whose punishment the system had demonstrated through executions that eliminated not merely individuals, but the institutional capacity for honest analysis that individuals had embodied. Nimitz faced a choice whose weight Layton could observe but not share. Trust Rochefort and position carriers for an ambush at Midway, risking everything if the analysis proved wrong. Trust Washington and disperse forces against threats whose locations remained uncertain, accepting that concentration against any single target might leave other targets vulnerable. The choice would be made by a commander whose willingness to hear alternatives had created the conditions within which alternatives could be presented. May 27, 1942, 9:15 a.m., Pearl Harbor, SINPAC, Headquarters. Admiral Chester William Nimitz stood before the wall map of the Pacific that dominated his office, studying positions whose arrangement would determine whether the United States Navy survived as an offensive force or ceased to exist as a meaningful factor in the war's Pacific theater. The office smelled of fresh coffee his steward maintained throughout working hours, the salt air that drifted through windows overlooking a harbor still scarred by December's attack, and the particular tension that accumulated in spaces where decisions of historical consequence were being made by men who understood their weight. Nimitz was 56 years old, the son of a Texas innkeeper who had died before Chester's birth, raised by a grandfather whose German immigrant pragmatism had shaped a temperament that subordinates found simultaneously calming and unreadable. He had assumed command of the Pacific Fleet 6 months earlier, arriving at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day to inherit a catastrophe whose dimensions exceeded anything American naval planning had anticipated. The battleships whose wreckage still protruded from the harbor's waters had represented the fleet that pre-war doctrine assumed would fight Japan. Their destruction had forced a reconstruction of strategy around the carriers that December 7th had spared, vessels whose survival now constituted the margin between continued resistance and strategic collapse. The intelligence that Rochefort's team had produced, confirmed by the water distillation ruse that had proven AF was indeed Midway, lay before him in summaries whose implications required no interpretation. The Japanese were coming with 4 carriers, possibly more, supported by battleships and transports that indicated an invasion force whose objective was the atoll itself. The attack would come in early June, approaching from the northwest along routes that Rochefort's analysis had identified through radio direction finding and decoded message fragments. The opportunity was extraordinary, advanced knowledge of enemy intentions that permitted positioning forces for ambush rather than reaction. Washington continued disagreeing. OP-20G's analysts maintained the intelligence was deception, that the Japanese had discovered American code-breaking capabilities and were feeding false information designed to draw the Pacific Fleet into a trap. The argument possessed surface plausibility that Nimitz could not dismiss without consideration. If the Japanese knew their codes were broken, feeding false intelligence about Midway while actually striking elsewhere would produce exactly the concentration of American forces in the wrong location that inferior Japanese numbers required to achieve local superiority. The water distillation confirmation might itself be part of an elaborate scheme whose sophistication reflected Japanese awareness of American methods. Nimitz weighed the competing analyses with the deliberation that consequential decisions demanded. Rochefort's team had lived inside Japanese communications for months, had developed intuitions about authentic traffic patterns that headquarters analysts examining the same intercepts from greater distance could not replicate. Leighton trusted Rochefort's conclusions with the confidence of a man who understood both the analyst and the enemy the analyst was studying. The field intelligence officers whose proximity to the Pacific provided perspectives that Washington's global view might obscure were unanimous. Midway was the target, early June was the timing, the northwest approach was the route. He made the decision that Soviet command culture would have made impossible. He chose to trust his field intelligence officers over Washington headquarters, to position his carriers based on analysis that contradicted the conclusions his superiors had reached, to risk the Pacific Fleet on the judgment of a commander working in a basement who wore a bathrobe over his uniform and carpet slippers instead of regulation shoes. Enterprise and Hornet would sail to a position northeast of Midway, joined by Yorktown, whose repairs had been compressed from 90 days to 72 hours through labor whose intensity matched the urgency that Rochefort's intelligence had established. The carriers would wait where Rochefort said the Japanese would appear, at the time Rochefort said they would appear, trusting analysis whose accuracy would be verified only when Japanese aircraft appeared on the horizon or failed to appear at all. The decision reflected not merely Nimitz's personal judgment, but the institutional culture that had made his judgment possible. A system that executed intelligence officers for analysis that contradicted leadership expectations could not have produced commanders willing to trust such analysis when it mattered most. June 4, 1942, 5:34 a.m., aboard USS Enterprise, 200 miles northeast of Midway. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Leighton stood in the flag plot adjacent to Admiral Raymond Spruance's bridge, studying position reports whose accuracy would be confirmed or refuted within hours. The ship smelled of fuel oil, fresh paint from repairs completed days earlier, and the breakfast that sailors were consuming at battle stations throughout the vessel. The tension that had accumulated during 2 days of waiting had reached its terminal phase. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese carriers were approaching Midway along the routes that Rochefort's analysis had identified. If the analysis was correct, the ambush that inferior American forces required was about to unfold. If the analysis was wrong, Enterprise and her companions had positioned themselves for destruction. The first contact report arrived at 5:52 a.m. from a Catalina patrol aircraft whose crew had spotted the Japanese fleet exactly where Station Hypo had predicted it would appear. The bearing was correct. The composition matched Rochefort's order of battle assessment. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, the concentration of naval power that fragmentary intercepts had revealed and Washington had dismissed as deception. The timing aligned with the early June window that decoded messages indicated. Every element of the analysis that Nimitz had trusted over headquarters objections was being confirmed by aircraft whose pilots could see what Cryptanalysis had anticipated. 200 miles to the south, at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort received the contact reports in the basement where his team had spent weeks constructing the picture that reality was now validating. The room's smell had not changed. Stale coffee, cigarette smoke, exhaustion made physical through accumulated odors that ventilation could not address. His analysts gathered around the radio receiver whose transmissions documented the unfolding engagement, listening to reports that confirmed their work with a precision that Cryptanalysis rarely achieved. The Japanese carriers were where the intercepts said they would be. The attack on Midway was proceeding as decoded messages had outlined. The ambush that Nimitz had positioned was about to spring. The battle itself belonged to pilots and sailors whose courage executed what intelligence had enabled. Torpedo squadrons from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown attacked the Japanese carriers through defensive fire that destroyed aircraft and killed crews with the efficiency that superior Japanese fighter cover guaranteed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet lost all 15 aircraft and 29 of 30 crew members without scoring a single hit. Sacrifice whose futility would have been complete except for what the sacrifice accomplished. The torpedo attacks drew Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level, leaving the carriers vulnerable to the dive bombers approaching from above. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from Enterprise found 3 Japanese carriers with flight decks covered in armed and fueled aircraft preparing for a second strike against Midway. The bombs that fell in the following 6 minutes destroyed Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, converting the pride of the Japanese Navy into burning wreckage whose fires would consume them by nightfall. Hiryu survived long enough to launch strikes that fatally damaged Yorktown, but Hiryu too was found and destroyed before sunset. 4 Japanese carriers, the force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the instrument of Japanese naval dominance across the Pacific, ceased to exist in an afternoon whose outcome Rochefort had made possible. The victory belonged to the men who fought, to the pilots who pressed attacks through fire that killed most of them, to the gunners who defended ships against strikes that damaged some and sank one, to the commanders who made tactical decisions whose correctness was proven by results. But the opportunity that those men exploited had been created by an intelligence officer in a basement who had argued against Washington, by a fleet intelligence officer who had carried that argument to a commander willing to hear it, by a command culture that permitted subordinates to challenge headquarters without fearing punishment that disagreement might invite. Nimitz received the battle reports at Pearl Harbor with the satisfaction of a commander whose trust had been validated by events whose outcome vindicated the analysis he had chosen to believe. The Japanese fleet was retreating westward, 4 carriers lighter than it had approached, the offensive that would have threatened Hawaii itself broken on the reefs of intelligence that the system had permitted to function. Midway remained American. The Pacific Fleet remained operational. The war would continue on terms that Japanese planners had not anticipated, because American intelligence officers had anticipated them first. The bureaucratic retribution that followed Midway arrived with the patience that institutional rivalry permitted when immediate punishment was unavailable. Joseph Rochefort received orders transferring him from Station Hypo in October 1942, 4 months after the victory his analysis had enabled, reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco, whose distance from intelligence work matched the distance that Washington rivals wished to place between Rochefort and the cryptoanalytic operations he had mastered. The orders smelled of the paper and carbon copies that military bureaucracy produced, ordinary documents whose ordinary appearance concealed the professional assassination they accomplished. The men at OP-20G whose analysis Rochefort had proven wrong possessed institutional power that being wrong had not diminished. They had recommended against awarding him the Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz had requested, had argued that his contributions to Midway had been exaggerated, had constructed a narrative in which Station Hypo's success reflected Washington guidance rather than contradicting it. The narrative was false. The narrative prevailed. Rochefort was removed from the work he had spent years mastering, assigned to duties whose irrelevance to the war's outcome matched the irrelevance that headquarters wished to impose on the man who had embarrassed them by being right. The punishment was real. the punishment was also survivable in ways that Soviet intelligence officers could not have assumed, regardless of how correct their analysis proved. Rochefort was not arrested. He was not interrogated in basements whose methods extracted confessions that accuracy could not prevent. He was not executed for the offense of contradicting superiors whose contradicted conclusions had been proven wrong. He served out the war in positions whose obscurity reflected bureaucratic revenge rather than judicial punishment, retired in 1947, and spent his remaining decades in a California whose sunshine could not warm the bitterness that unjust treatment had produced. He died on July 20, 1976, in Torrance, California, 76 years old, his contribution to Midway officially unrecognized by the Navy whose survival his analysis had helped ensure. The Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz had requested in 1942 finally arrived in 1986, 10 years after Rochefort's death, awarded posthumously when the men whose opposition had blocked it were themselves dead, and their opposition could no longer obstruct recognition that evidence demanded. His family received the medal in a ceremony whose belated acknowledgement could not compensate for decades during which acknowledgement had been denied. Edwin Layton continued serving as Nimitz's intelligence officer throughout the Pacific War, providing analysis whose accuracy at Midway established credibility that subsequent operations validated. He participated in planning that carried American forces across the Pacific through island campaigns whose progression Rochefort's early work had helped make possible. He retired from the Navy in 1959, spent years researching the intelligence history that his service had helped create, and published his account in 1985 under a title that acknowledged the collaboration his work had required, "And I Was There." The book documented what institutional trust had accomplished and what institutional rivalry had cost, the victory that analysis had enabled, and the injustice that analysis had suffered. Layton died on April 12, 1984, in Carmel, California, 81 years old. His memoir completed but not yet published, his testimony preserved for readers whose understanding of Midway would be shaped by his witness. The account he left documented a command culture whose willingness to hear dissent had produced decisions that dissent made possible, an institutional environment whose contrast with Soviet practice required no explicit articulation for readers who understood what the contrast meant. Chester Nimitz accepted the Japanese surrender aboard USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, signing documents whose completion ended the war that Midway had turned irreversibly against the nation now surrendering. He served as Chief of Naval Operations after the war, retired in 1947, and spent his final years in Berkeley, California, where he died on February 20, 1966, 80 years old. His reputation as the most successful American naval commander since Farragut, secured by victories whose foundations included the intelligence he had trusted, when trusting it required courage that headquarters pressure could not diminish. Three men whose collaboration had produced a victory that changed history. One was punished for being right through bureaucratic exile that ended his career. One documented what had happened through testimony that preserved the truth. One received the recognition that victory warranted, while the man most responsible for enabling that victory received only posthumous acknowledgement. The system had functioned imperfectly, had permitted rivalry to punish competence, had failed to protect the analyst whose analysis it had used. But the system had also permitted the analysis to reach commanders who could act upon it, had allowed subordinates to challenge headquarters without facing execution, had created conditions within which being right was survivable, even when being right was not rewarded. The imperfection was genuine. The contrast with systems that executed intelligence officers for less significant disagreements was also genuine. Rochefort's career was destroyed. Rochefort's life was not. The distinction mattered to the man who lived it and to the institution whose capacity for self-correction his survival demonstrated.